Hey guys, Ej right here, and today I'm going to be doing a classic album review of Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Work Volume 2. This is his second album, and this is one of the albums that I give a 10 out of 10 to throughout history. If you watched my most recent 10 out of 10 video where I explained what makes an album a 10 out of 10, this was on there. And this isn't the only kind of more abstract ambient type album on that list, but it's arguably the best. Released in 1994, this was Aphex Twin's second major release. I gotta say, compared to a lot of the other music from 1994, including albums that I would give a 10 out of 10 to, this one really stands out as being a really unique piece of music. Now, Aphex Twin is far and away from being the first ever artist to experiment with more ambient and abstract sounds and make a whole project out of that. Brian Eno was doing that 2 decades earlier, but there's something about the way Aphex Twin really takes that and really puts it at a higher level, in my opinion. There's something so abstract and strange about this album, yet there's also something so infectious about this album. When I first heard it, I probably wouldn't have given it a 10 out of 10, but something kept on bringing me back and listening. And over time, I would argue that it is unarguably a 10 out of 10 album for me. Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 is kind of mainly beatless songs, but even ones that do, you kind of forget that it's there, because the melodies, the beats, the rhythms throughout this thing are very hypnotic, and I think that's what keeps on bringing me to these tracks. It's not really an album that you listen to track by track and analyze each and every song. It's something that you need to sit down and listen to as a whole. And even if you're not listening to it as a whole, even if you just listen to a few songs and chunks, it still works because it's an ambient piece, not an album with a clear beginning or a clear end. However, there is one track that really sticks out to me as being a genuinely good independent track outside of the context of the album, and that would be number 3, Rhubarb. That song is one of the most beautiful melodies I've ever heard in a song. It's so hypnotic, and the little subtle details throughout it really makes the song feel... It's one of my favorite songs of all time. It doesn't even feel like it's as long as it is when you've been listening to it, because you get such in a trance while listening to it. This theme shows up throughout the course of this album, with many of these songs having that same atmosphere, the same feel, that really sucks you in. You don't even realize how long you've been listening to it. This is one of those projects where you could put it on in the background and still enjoy it, or you could sit down and listen to it in its whole and also still enjoy it. And I want to say that Aphex Twin's whole career is very similar to that. I quite enjoy many of his releases, some of the new stuff, some of the old stuff. To me, it's all pretty solid. However, the reason why this one sticks out to me as being a 10 out of 10 and as good as it is just because of how abstract he takes it. He pretty much took some of the more beat and some of the more dance elements of his first album, threw that out the window, and went full force into the synth pads, into the sounds, and the atmosphere. And he executed it perfectly in one of the greatest ambient albums I've ever listened to in my entire life. People say context is everything, and when you compare this album to a lot of the other stuff you were getting in the 90s, even from an electronic side, yes, there were ambient artists, but he really shined above the rest. And I would argue that compared to the popular music scene at the time, including albums I would give a 10 out of 10 to from even 1994, like Dookie, Smash, or Weezer Blue, this album really shines so bright and is so timeless. As much as I love Dookie, as much as I love The Offspring, Smash, or, any of that music from the 90s, it's very 90s sounding. And that's not primarily a negative thing, but that's not the kind of stuff I would expect to hear coming out today. However, Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 remains a timeless piece. If you never told me when this thing was recorded, it could have been anywhere between like the 70s and now, and I would believe you. At the end of the day, I just think Aphex Twin really hit it out of the park on this very ambient, very abstract, very atmospheric project that to me remains a timeless classic that I would argue is his best piece of work. This album to me is a strong 10 out of 10 because in my opinion it's everything that I want in an ambient piece of music, and it's executed in a way that remains timeless to this day, and I could listen to it in the background or I could sit down and listen to it in its entirety and still get the same amount of enjoyment from it no matter what. It really makes you think about what really makes music. A lot of people like to argue, well, beats is rhythm is a very essential part of music. Well, Aphex Twin proves that that's really not true. A lot of people also argue that a clear-cut Melody and harmony throughout it is also a big part of music, but Aphex Twin also proves that's not true. On a lot of these tracks, it's so ambient that sometimes you have a hard time even spotting a clear melody or harmony throughout the entire song, and yet it still works for some reason. If anything is true here, Aphex Twin proves that one of the most important parts of music in general is the overall atmosphere of it. A lot of people like to throw around the word aesthetic nowadays, and it can get cringy sometimes, but this is what this album is. It takes the aesthetic and the atmosphere of these pieces of work, even if they're not necessarily the most song-like, and manages to transform everything into a nice package that is one of the greatest pieces of ambient music ever recorded. So yeah, that's it for this review. Aphex Twin's a Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 is my favorite album of his, is a 10 out of 10 in my opinion, and it's a great album. There's very little negative to say here. I love this thing. That's about it for now. Goodbye.